Across the United States, in the late 19th and early to mid-20th century, redlining was practiced to refuse property to African Americans. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, redlining is the process of refusing a loan or insurance to someone because they live in an area deemed to be a poor financial risk. Using this term, property owners could claim that African Americans were a financial risk and therefore were legally kept from buying the land. One of the most common forms of redlining was through racially restrictive covenants. The Oxford English Dictionary defines restrictive covenants as a covenant imposing a restriction on the use of land so that the value and enjoyment of adjoining land will be preserved. Racially restrictive covenants were specifically targeted toward the purchaser's race. These covenants disallowed African Americans from buying and renting land. Racially restrictive covenants are recorded as early as the 19th century when Brookline, Massachusetts refused to sell any property to, quote, any Negro or native of the island. Provisions like these managed to evade racial zoning restrictions as set in place by the 1917 Buchanan Supreme Court decision. In fact, they were so prevalent that according to a 1928 report of deeds by Harland Bartholomew's committee, reported that racially restrictive covenants were, quote, in rather general use in the vicinity of the larger eastern and northern cities, which have experienced an influx of colored people in recent years. This same review concluded that these practices were legal and actually encouraged developers and planners to enact them. The Fair Housing Administration in the 1930s even sometimes required properties in Virginia to have racial covenants. According to Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, redlining was a prominent issue across the country. In New Jersey in 1925, property often read something like, quote, no part of said premises shall be used for any structure other than a dwelling place for people of the Caucasian race. In Seattle, W.E. Boeing developed suburbs between 1935 and 1944. All the residences stated that, quote, no property in said addition shall at any time be sold, conveyed, rented, or leased in whole or in part to any person or persons not of the white or Caucasian race. In Oakland, California, a neighborhood decided only people with, quote, pure Caucasian blood were allowed to live there. In parts of Daly City, California in 1950, property deeds read, quote, the real property above described or any portion thereof shall never be occupied, used, or resided on by any person not of the white or Caucasian race except in the capacity of the servant. Racially restrictive covenants were pushed to the forefront of people's minds in the mid-1940s. One possible cause for this was World War II. Some historians believe that in watching the unfairness and cruelty of Nazism, United States citizens became cognizant of the unfair treatment of African Americans. Regardless of the cause for the spark of discussion of racially restrictive covenants, it most likely culminated from the various housing policies, such as the 1917 Buchanan case, the 1928 Review, the 1930 American Housing Act, and the institution of the Fair Housing Administration. In 1948, the Supreme Court ruled in the Shelley v. Kramer case that racially restrictive covenants are unconstitutional. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 legally reinforces the Shelley decision. While the legislation did not necessarily end the practice of racially restrictive covenants right away, it brought about the gradual demise of racially restrictive covenants. In Cumberland County, as recently as 1972, there was an instance of racially restrictive covenants. An article in the Baltimore Afro-American reported that neighbors attempted to remove 3 black tenants based on their race from Cumberland County. The 3 tenants were Mrs. Milton Robinson, Mrs. Leon Ramsey, and Stephen Corbin. The tenants brought the case forward against DePaul Realty Company, which in turn denied all claims. The Cumberland County Court of Common Pleas decided that the company could not take any action to evict the tenants. While there are few recorded instances of racially restrictive covenants in Carlisle, there are still lasting impacts. A survey performed in the mid to late 20th century claims that African Americans in Carlisle were lower in community status than even the poorest white groups. The Carlisle Intercultural Council heard a report on a survey about it by Mr. Crocetti, a sociology professor, and his wife. The main problem they realized was overcrowding. They also identified electricity, heated water, gas stoves, and toilets as major inhibitors as well. 10% of Black households did not have electricity. Only 19% of Black households had hot water. Only 25% had gas stoves, and half only had outhouses in which to go to the bathroom. This report concluded that discrimination caused discrepancies with the rest of the residents of Carlisle, and until discrimination was dissipated, African Americans' lives would not improve. They hoped that this information would lead to a change in educational policies. The Hope Station area and north side of Carlisle are remnants of racially restrictive covenants, as families needed to move there because racially restrictive covenants kept them out of other parts of Carlisle. As of 2012, 91% of Cumberland County residents were white. Black households made a median of about half of what the white households did. In addition, the poverty and unemployment rates for Black households in Carlisle were higher than their white counterparts. However, current or near-current conditions in the area have been improving. Despite being filled with lower-income homes, the Hope Station area has not experienced a worsening rate of abandoned buildings. Overcrowding is also not a major issue around Hope Station. Overcrowding is no longer an issue in Carlisle, or more specifically in Hope Station. However, its community does pay high rental rates. Regardless of the improving conditions, redlining has taken on a new form now that racially restrictive covenants have been deemed unconstitutional. Unfair practices in bank loans and lack of access to transportation have inhibited African Americans' job opportunities because they cannot get a loan for housing purposes, and they cannot afford a car if they are not working, but they can't work if they can't get to their job. According to an article that analyzes the impediments to the fair housing choice in central Pennsylvania, segregation is currently maintained through housing discriminatory practices. This has led to the isolation of people based on race and income in the Hope Station area. In Carlisle specifically, the Fair Housing Act did not address segregation or transportation issues. It suggests that creating public transport might solve one issue and fix imbalances in poverty for people unable to go to work because they do not have a mode of transportation. Clearly, redlining is still an issue as it persists in at least 60 metro areas. According to some political scientists and historians, redlining has become more of a problem than it has ever been even in the Jim Crow era. Even in 2018, this is still an issue. Since Donald Trump's presidency, despite the various problems regarding racial discrimination, the Justice Department has not argued any case for racial discrimination practices. This is a problem because the median net worth of Black families remains only $9,000 against that of a white family, which is $132,000. Lenders have been able to get away with refusing loans on the basis that Black families have less money on average and therefore are often in debt and do not have strong credit histories. One woman claimed that lenders could set up people by falsifying bills to ruin credit scores and ensure they could not take out loans. Clearly, visible markers of segregation are still present, and because of modern-day practices of redlining, they have been reinforced and perpetuated.